Hi biologists, let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this section and following the biology syllabus, you should be able to understand that respiration may occur as a 1 or 2 stage process. Describe simply the 2 stages of respiration. State the cellular location of the first and second stage process. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to learn? Well, it's straightforward enough. You should be able to understand that respiration may be a 1 or a 2 stage process. You should be able to describe in simple terms the 2 stages of respiration. And you should be able to state where in the cell the first and second stage process takes place. Let's continue our look at respiration with a simple description. Respiration may be either a 1 stage process or a 2 stage process. Strictly speaking, if we're describing respiration as a 1 stage process, we are really describing anaerobic respiration. If we're describing respiration as a 2 stage process, then we are really describing aerobic respiration. So let's have a look at each of these types of respiration in turn. Anaerobic respiration is also known as fermentation or making alcohol. This has been known to man for thousands of years. Anaerobic respiration, as we have just said, is a stage 1 process. And if we are describing it simply, then we have to keep the following points in mind. It does not require oxygen. It releases a small amount of energy. It takes place in the cytosol. Now, the cytosol is a very important word. It actually refers to the cytoplasm minus the organelles. We use the word cytosol when we want to make it very clear that we mean the cytoplasm and nothing else. It is a very important word because it's specifically mentioned on the syllabus, so we have to use it and improve our vocabulary. In this stage 1 process or anaerobic respiration, glucose, which contains 6 carbons. You might recall that the formula for glucose in our previous video is C6H12O6, and there's your 6 carbons. So glucose, a 6 carbon chemical, is split into 2 3 carbon chemicals or 2 molecules, each of which have 3 carbons. You might recall that respiration is a catabolic reaction where complicated chemicals are broken down into simpler ones with the release of energy, and glucose here is split into 2 simpler 3 carbon molecules, bearing out the fact that respiration is catabolic. Now, anaerobic respiration or fermentation may occur in the presence of oxygen, but the important point is that it does not use it. What other points are important to add to a simple description of anaerobic respiration? Well, we have to understand that making alcohol or fermentation, the glucose is only partially broken down into 2 3 carbon molecules, and a small amount of energy is released. This is because these 2 3 carbon molecules still contain quite a bit of energy themselves. These 2 3 carbon molecules are then, depending on the cell where respiration is taking place, are converted to lactic acid if the anaerobic respiration is taking place in a muscle cell, or alcohol and carbon dioxide. Ethanol is the science word for alcohol. So, if you like, there are two types of anaerobic respiration: lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Don't forget, anaerobic respiration is less efficient. It does not release as much energy from glucose as aerobic respiration. This is because the glucose is only partially broken down. Let's have a look at each of these types of anaerobic respiration in turn. This is the word equation for lactic acid fermentation. Glucose is broken down to lactic acid and energy is released. The energy is released in the form of ATP. This occurs when muscle cells carry out respiration during intense exercise. During intense exercise, oxygen is in low supply, so the glucose will be broken down anaerobically into lactic acid. This lactic acid builds up in the muscle cells and is responsible for muscle soreness the next day. As time goes on, the lactic acid is taken to the liver where it is broken down and the muscle soreness disappears. For those of you able for a bit more, lactic acid fermentation also takes place when bacteria cause milk to go sour or when bacteria act on dairy products to make cheese and yogurt. Here is the word equation for alcohol fermentation, where the glucose is broken down in the absence of oxygen to alcohol, carbon dioxide, and energy. Again, just 2 molecules of ATP are produced. Now, this occurs when using yeast to make wine and beer, making alcohol, and it also occurs when using yeast to make bread. The yeast will anaerobically break down the glucose, forming alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. The alcohol evaporates, giving the nice smell of baking, and the carbon dioxide bubbles will be trapped and will cause the dough to rise. Alcohol fermentation also occurs in all plants when oxygen is limited. That is why we have elderflower wine, dandelion wine, peach wine, and so on. Let's look at an outline summary of anaerobic respiration. Outlines, provided they contain all the key points, can be very convenient. Quite often they can be used to summarize a lengthy, wordy description. So let's simply describe anaerobic respiration using an outline diagram instead. Here, in anaerobic respiration, glucose, which is a 6-carbon chemical, is broken down to 2 3-carbon molecules, releasing a small amount of energy. Just 2 ATPs are created. Remember, respiration is a catabolic reaction, and this is an example of catabolism, where a complicated chemical is broken down into simpler chemicals with the release of energy. What happens to these 2 3-carbon molecules depends on the location of the anaerobic respiration. If it is taking place in a muscle cell during intense exercise, then the 2 3-carbon molecules will be broken down to lactic acid. If it is taking place in a yeast cell during wine making or baking, then the 2 3-carbon molecules will be broken down to alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. So as we can see in summary, anaerobic respiration is a stage 1 process, and it takes place in the cytosol of the cell, which is the cytoplasm minus the organelles. Now, if you recall, we already said that respiration might be a 1-stage or a 2-stage process. We've just described respiration as a 1-stage process, or in other words, we've just described anaerobic respiration. We will now describe respiration as a 2-stage process, or in other words, we will simply describe aerobic respiration. Now, aerobic respiration is a 2-stage process. Stage 1 of the process does not require oxygen, releases a small amount of energy, takes place in the cytosol of the cell, which, as we already know, is the cytoplasm minus the organelles, and glucose, which is a 6-carbon chemical, is split into 2 3-carbon molecules. This should be ringing a bell. And of course, it is identical to our simple description of anaerobic respiration. Now, what happens next depends on whether oxygen is present or not. We are to assume that oxygen is present because we're describing aerobic respiration. So if oxygen is present, then stage 2 will take place. As a reminder, stage 2 does require oxygen, and it releases a large amount of energy, a total of 38 ATPs. Stage 2 takes place in the mitochondrion, which is an organelle or a structure within a cell. And in stage 2, the 2 3-carbon molecules are broken down to carbon dioxide and water. Now, these are the main points of a simple description of aerobic respiration, but do we need to add anything else? Well, we need to realise that the reactions are complicated. 2 3-carbon molecules formed in stage 1, like we said, are converted to carbon dioxide and water. In order for this to happen, the breakdown needs oxygen. It is a catabolic reaction. Stage 2 will not occur if oxygen is absent or is in low supply. A large amount of energy will be released, as much as 38 ATPs, because the glucose is completely broken down to carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide and water have very little energy. Therefore, all the energy has been practically released from the glucose. Now again, if we want to have a look at an outline description, as we've said already, this can be very convenient, and if it contains all the key points, then it can replace a lengthy, wordy description. And it might be no harm to make sure you have this diagram learned by heart. Practice in a jotter. In aerobic respiration, glucose, which is a 6-carbon chemical or molecule, is broken down to 2 3-carbon molecules, releasing a small amount of energy, 2 ATPs to be precise. This stage is referred to as a stage 1 process and takes place in the cytosol of the cell. What happens to the 2 3-carbon molecules is determined by whether oxygen is present or not. As we're describing aerobic respiration, oxygen will be present, and then the 2 3-carbon molecules will be completely broken down to carbon dioxide and water, releasing a large amount of energy, a further 36 ATP molecules, giving rise to a total of 38. This stage is called a stage 2 process and occurs in the mitochondrion of the cell. So as we can see clearly here, aerobic respiration is a two-stage process. Where does stage 1 and stage 2 occur in the cell? What is the cellular location of each of these processes? Stage 1 occurs in the cytosol, in other words, in the cytoplasm of the cell. This links in nicely with what we've learned before. In our study of cell structure, we learned that the cytoplasm was the site, hear that site sound? The cytoplasm is the site of chemical reactions. Now we know that the cytoplasm is the site of respiration. Stage 2 occurs in the mitochondrion, and again, this ties in with what we've learned before. We've learned in our study of cell structure that the function of the mitochondrion was to carry out respiration, that it was the powerhouse of the cell. Now we understand why, because a large amount of energy is released when glucose is completely broken down to carbon dioxide and water in aerobic respiration. And there you have it. Practice in a jotter. Now that we have reached the end of our lesson, have we achieved our objective? Can you understand that respiration may occur as a 1 or 2 stage process? Can you describe simply the 2 stages of respiration? Can you state the cellular location of the first and second stage process?